Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. I am John Schmeelk, joined by a friend of the program. We've been doing this probably for the better part of 10 years now, Rob Rang. He's a draft analyst for Fox Sports, also a scout for the CFL, and he joins us to talk about some draft prospects today and preview the NFL Combine. Rob, how are you, man?
I'm doing very well, John. It's always a pleasure to be with you. How are you?
We're doing great. Pardon the boxes in the background. We're renovating the basement, and this has become a storage area. So we're doing the best we can over here at home, which is always a challenge. So, um, let's start here. This is going to air, Rob, at the end of the week prior to the combine. So we don't quite know all the details yet of who's doing what. What's your feeling on what's going to happen with the quarterbacks? Who's going to throw and who's not going to throw?
That's $1 million question. Let me just say this right off the bat. I would love to see both Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders compete. That's what we all want. The fact that Cam Ward, of course, opted out of the second half of the bowl game. Opted not to participate in any of the senior all-star games. Shedeur Sanders, fairly famously shows up to the East West Shrine Bowl, but then does not compete there. So this is an opportunity. And if I am an evaluator who is, has to strongly be considering a quarterback this year, then again, I am just kind of pounding the table like, gentlemen, this is your opportunity to compete. And especially if you're Cam Ward. Look, Cam Ward has a stronger arm. He's a better athlete. And I think that it would make a lot of sense for him to compete against Shedeur Sanders and everybody else in this quarterback class. But at the same time, I do think that both quarterbacks feel very confident. They can just wait for their pro day, allow NFL teams to come in and kind of cater to them. So, look, I'm like you, John, like a lot of our listeners here. I am eager to see what decisions are made. We live in a different era, as we know, but at the same time, I do think that both quarterbacks are legitimate early first round caliber prospects, and they can help a team immediately.
All right. What do you think is more important for these two guys? Is it if they do throw, how they look throwing the football, or are the meetings with the teams as they try to figure out whether or not these quarterbacks are not only good enough on the field, Rob, but are the type of guys they want representing their franchise? And frankly, and they're going to learn more in the 30 visits, obviously, when they have longer periods of time with these guys, how they see the game, how they do their progressions, how they process information on the field, how quickly they see things, what their recall is. These are all things at the quarterback position that can determine success or failure as much as the physical stuff that is really hard to see from tape until you get these guys with you in a room talking ball with them.
Yeah, I think that it absolutely is the interviews rather than the actual workout itself. Look, I've been to, I don't know, dozens of pro day workouts, combines, and I can name a number of prospects at the quarterback position who have looked terrific on air. Of course, there's no defensive players out there when you're throwing the ball. So that is important. I want to see the velocity in person. I want to see the accuracy in person. I want to see the way that they interact with their so-called teammates, because of course some of these players they've never met before. But the most critical factor is how do they interact with the head coach, with the offensive coordinator, with the quarterback coach. So those interviews are so much more important, at least in my opinion, especially at the quarterback position, especially when we're talking about players who, in both the cases with Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, of course, have transferred. What do their former teammates and coaches think of them, and how are they, again, going to be able to interact with the NFL decision makers who might be bringing them into the fold?
What do you think the top of this draft is going to look like, Rob? How early are Cam and Shedeur going to go off the board? And then where do you think some of the other quarterbacks might end up landing? The Jackson Darts, the Jalen Milrose, Tyler Shucks, guys like that.
Yeah, in my opinion, there are four true blue chippers in this draft class, and four is a very small number. And so I have been among those who have been critical of this draft class, and you hate to call any draft class weak because the players who are in this class, of course, have pride, and many of them have a great deal of NFL talent. I just personally believe that there's an awful lot of guys who should be drafted in that 100 to 150th, 125th overall kind of range, second, third day prospects that are fighting to be first round picks this year. Just NIL and the transfer policy is allowing an awful lot of players to go back to college football that normally would be kind of pushed into this draft class. And I mentioned the four players that I think are blue chip prospects. Unfortunately, that among them is not a quarterback. I think that the edge rusher Abdul Carter from Penn State, the cornerback Travis Hunter, the running back Ashton Genty, and then the tight end Tyler Warren from Penn State. To me, those are the absolute spectacular players in this draft class that almost regardless of what you're looking to do, those players fit in. There's an awful lot of players out there I think are right on the cusp. But the interior defensive lineman, for example, from Michigan, Mason Graham, I think is right on the cusp of that as well. That said, I do think that you're going to see those 4 or 5 players, as well as the 2 quarterbacks, be among the top 10 picks. I don't think you're going to see a lot of surprises in the top 6, 7, 10 picks this year. Once you get into the middle and late rounds of the first round, however, or late portion of the first round, I should say, then I think you're going to see an awful lot of guys that some prognosticators are saying this guy is a second, third round selection. He's going to wind up going number 14 overall or 15 overall. And that's where this draft is going to get a little bit crazy.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think there's going to be situations here, Rob, where one team has a guy 15, another guy team has him 50. And frankly, I just think that's the way this draft class is going to be. Does that make the combine that much more important where, this board is so different from team to team? There's so much volatility that testing, the personal experience with the interviews, all these things can really move guys since it's such a mess there once you get past that top tier of 10 to 12 guys.
That's a good point. I do think that the combine is going to be more important this year than in most years. John, you and I have been doing this for an awful long time, as you referenced before. And again, I do think that the combine itself is more important this year than most. And a big part of that is, again, there's so many players that have played at multiple different programs and things like that. So it's not necessarily the athletic testing that I think is going to be more important. I think that the interview process is going to be absolutely critical, as it always is. The medical evaluation is going to be absolutely critical, as it always is. But I really do believe that if there's a guy that basically nobody is talking about, that suddenly runs a 4.3 or does a Dexter Lawrence who puts up 39 repetitions or something like that, just an obscene number, especially considering he has really long arms. Those are the type of numbers that absolutely could kind of tilt the scale in their favor. Look, at this point, we're a couple of months away from the draft. Every single player that was invited to Indianapolis, the scouts have already watched. They know what to expect. But if a guy surprises you, again, you could talk yourself into the thought that maybe this is a player who is on the upswing and every team falls in love with that upside potential.
Yeah, I always tell people the raw numbers for the testing at the combine aren't important. It's what they are compared to what you expected the player to do. Like if you go in and you think the player is going to be really fast and he's really fast, you're like, all right, cool. He can stick right where he is. But if you think a guy's slow and then he pops like a 4.42, you're like, oh, maybe I need to rethink this guy. So it's really about what your expectations are compared to what the guys actually do.
There's no question about it. And that's the thing is that sometimes it's a player doesn't perform quite up to expectations, but is he one of those players who's so darn instinctive that anticipates so well that he just has a little bit of a wiggle in his route or the way that he bounces off of contact or whatever? There are players that, frankly, when they don't work out quite as well as I expected, and I watch them on tape, and I think, hey, well, then the rest of the world just, is going to lose sight of this player, and I'm going to look like a genius 3, 4, 5 years down the road because I know this guy can actually play. And then there's the flip side. Those players that don't play quite as fast, but my goodness, can they run? Can they lift? Can they move when they don't actually have to compete against somebody against them? They're not wearing the football helmet and the football pads, So that to me is one of the reasons why the combine is a piece of the puzzle, but it is not the puzzle entirely.
Yeah, a lot of times if a player is mentally sharp and fast and they're able to anticipate better than other players, they might be a 4.56 player, but they play like a 4.45 player because they're so sharp mentally and they anticipate, they see things before it happens. So yeah, I'm with you. Those are all things that you have to put into the equation when you're evaluating these players. They do medicals at the combine, obviously, Rob. We don't get access to that sort of stuff, but who are some of the players that you think teams are excited to kind of get their doctors onto, take a look at them when they're making their determination on where they want to draft them?
Unfortunately, there are an awful lot of players in this class who are injured stepping into this process. I mean, like for me, the number one offensive tackle, the most athletically gifted offensive tackle, in my opinion, is Josh Simmons from Ohio State. Previously at San Diego State, he's played left and right tackle. He tore his ACL. Obviously, teams want to make sure that he's okay. I would argue that two of the better corners in this class,
Yeah.
Siobhan Ravel, Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame. Again, same story. You want to make sure that they're okay. I make the same argument for Curtis Schmeelk, a quarterback who I'm high on from Indiana, previously in Ohio. I think that he is one of those day three sleepers. But my goodness, if the reports are true that he played all of last season with a torn ACL, well, then the guy is incredibly tough. But B, then what is the medical prognosis about his long-term future? That is something you have to consider. But it's not so much those guys. I think I'm fascinated always by the players that come in and that have just been beaten up over their college career. Like for example, one of the blue chip players I mentioned before, the Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty, who I'm sure the Giants fans are going to be, very interested in. I mean, just because of the fact that again, he's a blue chip caliber player. I have a lot of respect for Tyrone Tracy and what he did for the Giants this year. But again, Ashton Jeanty to me is a player that you look at him and the fact that he led the Mountain West Conference in rushing and receiving attempts as a junior. And then this past season, Johnny, he basically doubled his attempt. I mean, what kind of tread, we use the term tread left on their tires. What kind of tread left on his tires at this point? Those slimmer quarterbacks, a Quinn Ewers or a Dylan Gabriel, if they had any kind of dings on their resume when it comes to the medical evaluations, that could absolutely sink a prospect. So to me, that is who I'm talking about here. Is that look for the high end prospects, the guys who are clear cut first round caliber players, like a Josh Simmons, the offensive tackle I mentioned before. You just want to check the box. But I think that this draft is going to be, or this combine is going to be fascinating because the medical evaluations, I think, are going to ding some players that could be middle round prospects and absolutely sink their stock. So I am interested to see some of the more talented players in this draft class. I think are also some of the guys with the biggest question marks coming in to the NFL combine, at least the medical evaluation part of it.
All right, we hit the quarterbacks already. Who are 3 to 5 guys you're most excited to see on the field with their testing that you think could really help themselves over the course of the week in Indianapolis?
Well, there's an awful lot of guys, of course. That's the fun part, And so to me, I'm going to kind of go through a couple of different players, a couple of different positions, and obviously some of them are the blue chip guys. Like when I watched Chop Robinson, the edge rusher from Penn State on tape, to me, he is the most explosive player, regardless of position in this draft class. I just want to see what he runs. I just want to be a fan, get some popcorn, and just kind of watch what he is able to run. Would not be surprised if he comes in at,
Rob,
6'2",
Rob, real
6'3".
quick, you had a Freudian slip there. You said Chop Robinson because he was the guy at
Oh,
Penn State last year. Nobody, you're right. I know. I think it's funny because Abdul Carter is that type of athlete. Except you know what? He's got the production too.
it really is. And I apologize for the Freudian slip because you're 100% correct. They're very similar players. I mean, of course, Chop Robinson was the edge rusher his entire career. And with Abdul Carter, previously played linebacker, then moved over to that edge rusher position. But my goodness, you see almost linebacker, almost safety speed sometimes with the way that he is able to change direction. I expect him to measure similarly to his former teammate, Chop Robinson. In terms of 6'3", 250 pounds, if he winds up running the 4.4s, like a lot of the trainers buzz out there that you're hearing, then my goodness, how does he not go at least in the top three and perhaps number one overall Tennessee Titans? So to me, he is the number one player. And same kind of conversation here with Travis Hunter. I mean, just for obvious reasons. But let's dig a little bit deeper than that. I think at the quarterbacks, we saw Anthony Richardson just absolutely light the whole athletic stage on fire in Indianapolis. And so I'm curious to see what Jalen Monroe is going to do. Tez Johnson, the wide receiver from Oregon. Look, he's 160 pounds, probably soaking wet. But my goodness, if he runs in the 4.2s, 4.3s, if he is the fastest wide receiver in this draft class, as some are projecting, then yeah, that's got to create a whole bunch of attention as well. I'm looking for the guys that maybe don't have quite as much national attention. One of the guys I'm especially interested in is the Stanford wide receiver, Alec Ayumano. To me, he is a guy, 6'2", 210 pounds. At least that's what he was listed as, a redshirt sophomore by Stanford. I think he's going to run in the 4.4s. I think that he is going to make a real push to be one of the very first wide receivers, maybe even the first wide receiver who was selected this year. I don't know if anybody's thinking about that, but give us a couple of weeks. We'll see if Stanford, a wide receiver, could wind up being one of the most exciting prospects in this draft class. Again, I don't know that a lot of people are thinking that, but here we go, a couple of weeks away from the combine.
Yeah, that's always fun. All right, we hit quarterback. Let's go through some of the other positions. Offensive line, Rob. This is one of those classes to me where you have a bunch of guys that played offensive tackle in college, and NFL evaluators aren't sure they can play offensive tackle in the NFL. So I think we're going to see arm length for a lot of these guys, and we got a lot of those measurements already at the Senior Bowl. So we got some idea with some of these guys, whether or not we think they can move inside. But the two big ones, Kelvin Banks and Will Campbell, are two guys we have not gotten arm measurements on in terms of length. To me, it's going to be huge for those two. Anyone else that you want to keep an eye on in terms of those length measurements for offensive tackles when you worry about where they might have to move at the next level.
Yeah, those are absolutely two of the biggest ones. Just because, again, they're you watch them on tape, they're easy first round selections, considering the talent that they've demonstrated, the durability that they've shown, the level of competition they faced. I think Donovan Jackson, of course, was a guard previously at Ohio State, moved outside when the aforementioned Josh Simmons went down with that injury. And the fact that Donovan Jackson, got better and better and better as Ohio State went through their entire national championship process, to me, he is a fascinating. I could see a lot of NFL offensive line coaches say, hey, I can work with this guy. He is getting, as I said, better and better. Maybe he can play at the outside the tackle position. Armand Membo from Missouri, one of my absolute favorite players in this draft class. Of course, as you mentioned, he also went to the Senior Bowl, came in with a little bit longer arms,
Yeah.
6'3" and a half, 320 pounds. I think he can play that right tackle position just because he is so agile. But my goodness, I think he can be a great guard as well. So to me, those are some of the fascinating players. And I'll say this as well, John. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've had some opportunities to actually dabble into the scouting process, not just the analytical process. And I can tell you that there are an awful lot of NFL teams who subscribe a whole bunch more attention to not only the 10 and 20-yard splits to offensive linemen, as a lot of people talk about, the actual 40-yard dash times. If you want to look at guys who actually NFL teams give an opportunity to stay at tackle, even if they come in at 6'3", even if they come in at 32-inch arms, it does come down to 40-yard dash times. I promise you, there will be tackles who come in a little bit shorter arms, but because they come in at 4.98 or because they come in at 5.02, those are the guys that NFL teams are going to give one last opportunity to play that outside position before they move them inside the guard.
Huddle up, get in here. If you're lined up here, you gotta go over the middle with it to score.
Right. How do we make that happen?
I don't know, but Citizens does. Make sense of your money with Citizens, official bank of Eli Manning.
I'll keep an eye on Marcus Bowe out of Purdue. I could see him being one of those guys that breaks that 5-second barrier. But some people think he might be a center too. So we'll see how that ends up going for him, a guy with multi-possessional flexibility. All right, running back. You already mentioned Ashton Jeanty. We know what a star he is. But this is a loaded class, Rob. Day 2 is going to be littered with a bunch of running backs. What are evaluators looking for at that position at the combine? Some people make such a big deal out of the 40-yard dash for running back. Sure. For me, I've seen a bunch of running backs run mediocre 40 times. They end up being great running backs in the pros. What's important for that position when these evaluators watch these guys in person on the field do their workouts?
But for me, the actual more important measurable skill is actually the 3-cone time. I love the lateral agility that it takes, the balance that it takes to have a good short shuttle and 3-cone time. I personally prioritize those over 40-yard dash.
Me too.
But good to know. The number one thing that I look for on tape is just balance through contact. Can you get knocked over and then still be able to regain your balance quickly and then obviously accelerate at that point? And so that's the thing, is that I see an awful lot of running backs in this class, and I 100% agree with you. I think that running back is one of the strengths of this class. I love guys like the Ohio State duo, Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, to me, are the bee's knees. Those are two guys I think are going to go in day two, and both of them are going to wind up being stars in the NFL. Look, Ashton Jetty's a superstar. We know that. But Caleb Johnson, another guy from Iowa that just kind of exploded onto the scene. We talk about lateral agility and bouncing off of contacts. To me, Dylan Sampson from Tennessee, I think that he should basically, we're in this NIL and transfer policy time. I'm curious how like General Electric or Maytag didn't just like offer some type of a deal to Dylan Sampson and just nickname him Spin Cycle, because the guy just spins off of contact as well as anybody that I've seen in years. I mean, he's probably 200 pounds, so he's much smaller back, but still, I just really like his ability to bounce off of contact, the spinning, the coordination, the lateral agility that requires, to me, is next level stuff, and I think translates very well to the NFL.
Yeah, I'll just bring up one guy to you because I think his testing is actually going to be pretty important, and that's Cam Scatabo out of Arizona State. Because you watch him run, to your point, he's got great contact balance. It's hard to bring down. He bounces off guys. He catches the football well. But I do wonder about the acceleration, the burst, and the overall top speed. We've seen him get caught from behind. So I do think for him, if he tests really well, Rob, he could be a second-round pick. If he doesn't, he runs in the 4.6s. His other testing's not great. I could see him falling back a little bit.
I 100% agree with you. I almost cut you off there and asked you just to put yourself out there. I mean, and guesstimate what we think the Cam Scatterbo is going to be. To me, he's 4.55 and maybe north of that, maybe 4.6. At the same time, he's a hell of a player.
I know.
So you get excited about him. Oh my goodness, I do too. And so if we're gonna go back old school New York Giants, we're talking like O.J. Anderson kind of stuff. I mean, a guy that will put you on the seat of your pants, but at the same time, I don't know if he's going to outrun anybody. So in a running back class as tightly packed as this one is, I have to agree with you. I think Cam Scatterbo maybe has as much on the line when it comes to the actual 40-yard dash time as probably any player, especially among the running backs, but maybe any player in this entire draft class.
Yeah, I'm with you. All right, let's jump to the wide receiver class. And you mentioned it. This is another one where I think there's a lot of volatility here, Rob. It's not a class like we've seen the last couple of years. It's a shallower class. You might only have 5 guys maybe in the first 2 rounds, something like that, maybe a little bit more, but not much more. I think you had 5 guys in the first 40 picks last year, in the first 30 picks last year. There were so many wide receivers that went. So you already talked about Ayamanor from Stanford potentially moving up. Ted McMillan's the guy at the top. I'm a big fan of his. I wonder what he's going to run. I think that's an important time. We could talk about that. But who else at this wide receiver spot do you think could really see some attention? Like a guy like Emeka Egbuka is like boring, but he's good. Like, is he going to surprise people with this speed? I just think, again, this is another position where I think guys can move up and down here based on their testing. Luther Burden, like if he tests off the charts, that's going to really help him because he's the guy that relies on his athleticism. He's not a polished route runner, right? So I think this wide receiver class is also, given nobody had overwhelming tape except for McMillan this year, that I think testing is going to play a big role in what order these guys go off the board.
Yeah, and I'll push back a little bit on Ted McMillan's tape. I mean, you watch his drops. There's some ugly drops. This is a guy who's got talent. I love the positional versatility at his size. I
thought he cleaned it up a little bit in his final year. It was, I thought he was a little bit better in his last year.
I think he was too. But at the same time, to me, that is still very much a concern. Obviously, just catching football is one of those coachable things.
Which is funny, by the way, because he's actually a really good hands catcher. He's not a body catching guy. Like, he will get his hands out there and catch it, but he has been eaten up by some drops. You're right.
Well, and there are times, and for those of you who are watching us in video, then you might be able to see this. And if you're not, basically, if your thumbs are, touching each other, then that, of course, is one of the correct ways to catch a football if the ball is outside of your pads. Otherwise, he does a lot of this. And that, of course, is technically incorrect. And there's too many times on the sideline when he's got people close in contact. When you're a guy who is as tall as Ted McMillan is, I'm curious to see what he actually measures. And I expect him to be 6'4", 6'5". Yeah, so a guy that should be able to win a bunch of jump balls, and he did. But at the same time, I want to see him be better than what I saw on tape for a guy that is being bandied about as a top 10 selection. As I mentioned before, Ayamanor, to me, is one of the bigger receivers in this class where he has size and receiving and just soft hands. So to me, he's one of the guys I'm intrigued by. Luther Burden is another one. Again, I expect him to run in the low 4.5s to high 4.4s. At least that's what I see on tape as far as his agility and his ability to accelerate. Another player that I am very intrigued by based on his tape, based on just LSU's tradition of producing guys. And then he wound up transferred to TCU. That's where he wound up having his kind of breakthrough season here. But then goes to Senior Bowl. I thought that he was the best receiver on the field. That's Jack Besh. And so to me, another guy that I don't necessarily expect that he's going to run in the 4.3s, but he is a guy that's very efficient, that makes plays after he gets the ball in his hands. Those are the type of guys that I'm really excited about. And then if we're going to day three, a couple of other guys that also, or at least in the case of Ja'Cory Brooks from Louisville, is a transfer from Alabama, but I see a playmaker. And then another sleeper. I was going to save this one for later, but just because you got me your receivers, and now I'm going to, kind of frothing now at the mouth talking about some of these guys. Ricky White the third from UNLV, I think is a player that from out west, and not a lot of people are talking about, but when you watch him on tape, he gets open and he makes big plays. And so to me, those are the intriguing things. And it's a wide receiver class that, as you articulated earlier, it has an awful lot of volatility because there's a lot of guys that have big names, but don't necessarily play a lot of press or can't catch the ball quite as well as you expect of an early NFL draft pick.
Yeah, so McMillan was tracked for 7 drops this year, Rob, which, a lot of targets, not a huge number, but more than you want. Only 2 the previous year. So more targets, obviously more opportunities, a couple more drops this year. So something definitely to keep an eye on with him as we move forward, as we evaluate this group of wide receivers. Giants Huddle Podcast is brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From game day celebrations to your everyday financial needs, Big Blue fans can get the most out of every moment with Citizens. Learn more at citizensbank.com/Giants. All right, tight end. You already mentioned Tyler Warren, and I was really mad because Daniel Jeremiah tweeted this the other day, and I had watched both Warren and Lovell, and I did my final look at all their targets and stuff last week. And I kind of sat there, I'm like, these guys are going to be listed in the same position group, but they really are different players. They play the position a completely different way. And the way Jeremiah put it on Twitter was, I'm going to have a Gronk bucket of tight ends and a Kelsey bucket of tight ends. And Loveland's a Kelsey, this is my words, not his, and Warren's a Gronk, right? And, I compare Loveland a lot to Dalton Kincaid, who came out a couple years ago and went to the Bills, right? I think they're similar players with the way they play, body type, the way they move, and I love Dalton Kincaid. But they really are different types of players with how they're used, how they're going to be used, even though they're both listed at tight end.
Yeah, and that to me is one of the real storylines of this draft class. There's an awful lot of players who are kind of in that Travis Kelce mold, and a lot of others are in that kind of Gronk mold. And so to me, again, that is kind of fascinating. And I think that the Tyler Warren, just the body control, I think that in the way that projects to today's NFL, I think that you are going to see a guy that is going to just give you more bang for your buck, frankly. If you are an offense, as I expect most NFL teams are going to be, that want a guy who's going to be a seam stretcher, who's going to be able to break away from people. At the flip side, you have a guy that is able to actually move people at the line of scrimmage, the way that Coach Loveland was able to do, the way he was, brought into Michigan to do from Jim Harbaugh originally, of course. I think that there is still a place for those guys, and especially considering how the Super Bowl went. Again, I think there's going to be a refocus on physicality. I'll tell you a player that, kind of going back to that Tyler Warren conversation, a couple of guys that really jump out at me. If you're not willing to invest a number 10 overall or something earlier than that kind of a selection in a tight end, round to the top of the second round, maybe a Mason Taylor from LSU, or heck, way into day 2, maybe even day 3. Rondé Gadsden Jr., from Syracuse, of course. You're going to know, you and a lot of your listeners and viewers are going to know him very well. Just the upside that he showed. I mean, his very first full season at the tight end position explodes for the 7 touchdowns this past season for Syracuse. Again, just the body control, the ability to high point passes. There are receivers in this class that don't catch the ball as fluidly as Rondé Gadsden at the tight end position does. So to me, those are some of the players that, to your point, make tight end much more of a diverse positional group than we've ever seen in the past.
Yeah, Elijah Arroyo, another guy that's in that,
Yes.
Kelsey group. He was awesome at the Senior Bowl. Nobody could cover him. I like Terrence Ferguson out of Oregon. I think he was a pretty good player too. Gunnar Helm, who was supposed to be at the Senior Bowl, didn't end up going. I think he's a good receiver. So you're right. And then you have other guys. Trying to think. There was a couple blockers too that are in the other category that were down there. So a lot of guys to choose from. Again, running back and tight end have been positions, and we'll get to defensive tackle in a second, which is another that we've been pretty shallow at over the last few years, and I think we're finally starting to beef up at those spots this season. All right, let's go to the defensive side of the ball here, Rob. Let's go up front. Let's start the defensive tackles. I mentioned it. This is a position that I think has been really tough to find good players over the last 2 or 3 years. But boy, there are a lot of good defensive tackles, and teams going to have plenty of different types to choose from. Again, some smaller guys that are good, and then some guys that bring a little bit more beef.
There's some guys that bring a lot of beef in this draft class. And look, I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, that to me, one of the most remarkable athletic achievements I've ever seen at the combine was back in 2019 when I saw Dexter Lawrence put up 36 repetitions with 34 and 3/4 inch arms. Look, there's guys who have put the bar up more often than Dexter Lawrence did, but didn't have the arm length. And look, it's just simple physics. If you got short arms, believe me, I got an A in PE all those years ago because I had short arms. And so I was able to put up the bench press a little bit more often than one of our so-called elite athletes at that level. And I was feeling pretty strong and confident in myself. But once I started to understand the physics aspect of it, then I recognized, well, this is a much more powerful young man than I ever dreamt of being. Well, I mentioned the Dexter Lawrence numbers because, again, I think that is one of the most unbelievable athletic, opportunities that I've ever seen from any athlete. It would be 40-yard dash times, or anything else. And so I think there's a couple of guys here that maybe aren't going to be quite as powerful as Dexter Lawrence, but I'm fascinated to see with Kenneth Grant, for example, the big defensive tackle at Michigan. He's 6'4", 342 pounds. At least that's what he was listed at back at the East-West Shrine Bowl. I'm curious to see if he does wind up running as fast as some are saying, under 5 seconds. If he puts up the 35-plus-inch reps in the bench press, to me, those are numbers that are very much as impressive as, say, the 40-yard dash times, the vertical jumps. All the numbers that get people excited. I'm fascinated to see on switching over to like some of the edge rushers. What a James Pierce from Tennessee. The fact that he started off each of the last 2 seasons not quite as productive as perhaps hoped, considering his explosiveness. But the fact that he ended both seasons very, very hot, going up against SEC competition, if he winds up running in the 4.5s at 6'4", 250 pounds, to me, that is a guy that is absolutely going to skyrocket up the boards. And I think in terms of like, if you're going to be evaluating players and how you're going to kind of stack this board, some of the bigger body defensive ends, Nick Scorton from Texas A&M, and Jack Sawyer from Ohio State. I mean,
Jamar
heck,
Stewart,
his teammate.
another one, right?
Yes,
Jamar Stewart.
Exactly. JTT from Ohio State as well. Shamar Stewart, to me, is going to be one of the guys who's going to be, I should have mentioned him before, as far as the guys I'm most excited about for the combine. His size and speed, I mean, it's off the charts. Is he as good of a football player as he's an athlete? That, of course, is one of the bigger questions of this draft class.
Yeah, no question about it. I'm with you. I'm curious to see what Deion Walker looks like. And he's so physically gifted. Doing my summer scouting last summer, Rob, I thought he could be a top 10 pick. That's how good I thought he looked in 2023. And then I watched him in 2024, a month ago. I started going through the Deion Walker tape, and I'm like, what happened to this guy? He looks like a different player. And we know he's huge. We know he's an athlete. I'm curious to see not necessarily what he's going to weigh, because he weighed around 340 at the Senior Bowl, and I think that's where we all kind of expect him to come in at, which is fine. But what does his body look like, right? Like, does it a solid 340? Like, when Dexter Lawrence walked into the Giants facility at 340, it's like, that man's not fat. Like, he's just gigantic. Like, is Deion Walker going to be 340 and look good, or is he going to be 340 and look sloppy, right? That's one of the guys I'm kind of thinking about. And then for the smaller guys, like Walter Nolan, like TJ Sanders, they're 285-pound defensive tackles, right? We know they're going to test well, but I think teams want to see those guys test exceptionally. If you're only 285 pounds, you better be a really good athlete if you're going to play 3 technique at that size.
Yeah, good point. And I think of the two, Walter Nolan is much more likely to do that. I mean, on the tape, I see a guy who has such quick twitch To me, that he is, I expect him to run in 4.85, 4.9, which is, spectacular numbers for a defensive tackle. And again, the three cone, the short shuttle, really show off the change of direction, the explosiveness, the vertical jump, those types of things that demonstrate that explosiveness. I expect to see that based on Walter Nolan's tape. With Sanders, to me, he's a very good football player. I like his power. I think that he's actually more of a power guy than just a quick guy. And so I'm intrigued to see what he does. I'm not expecting quite as explosive a numbers of him. But again, he's one of those that I'm going to kind of chuckle to myself if he doesn't produce as well as expected and winds up falling a little bit down the board. That I think some lucky NFL team is going to find him maybe in the second, third round and find a decade-long starter in the league.
Yeah, so I think guys are going to get pushed down at these spots, right? Because the edge and defensive tackle classes are so deep. Who are some of your favorite round 2, round 3, maybe even start of round 4 guys that you think could slip through the cracks that could give teams really good value a little bit later on in the draft?
Well, and we just talked about one of them in Sanders. TJ Sanders, to me, is one of those guys that I really like on tape. I think that he's got untapped potential to him. I would mention another guy that I don't think is going to work out very well, but I just love his tape, and that's Nebraska's Ty Robinson. He was a guy that could play defensive tackle. He could play outside defensive end based on if you want to do even or odd front. I love the fact that he gets his hands up. When the quarterback is trying to throw the ball, he doesn't have as long arms as I was expecting. I was expecting him to have 34 plus inch arms. He's got like 32 and a half, but he's 12 passes broken up over his career. I mean, there's a lot of guys who are 6'7", have 36-inch arms that just can't find the football in a sporting goods store. Ty Robinson does get those passes batted up. And create some interception opportunities for his teammates. And then another guy, Boise State's Ahmad Hassanin, to me, is one of the most fascinating storylines of this entire draft class.
I had like a 10-minute conversation with him at the Shrine Bowl, Rob. What an unbelievable kid. He's just a great kid.
Exactly. So you're rooting for him from a human perspective. And then you watch the athlete and what he has made of himself. Well, look, he's one of those guys I don't think has necessarily the highest upsides. I think he's already worked so darn hard to achieve what he is. He just feels like a guy that is going to just, we use this expression all the time, just break through a brick wall for you. He is the guy that will break through that brick wall for you and then rebuild it back up if that's what his coach wants him to do. And I think that's the kind of guys that you can win with in the league.
If you want to know how to manage 2 minutes of crunch time football, I'm your man. But if you're wondering about a long-term financial plan, you should talk to Citizens. Hey, I can also talk lawn care.
I'd like to learn about a mowing routine.
Yes, I knew I could help. Make sense of your money with Citizens.
All right, off-ball linebackers, Rob, just anyone that you are looking forward to seeing them test. I think testing for that position is hard. I think so much of what makes a good middle linebacker and Mike linebacker is how they see the game and how quickly they react and read things, which you can't see on the field at a training event like the Combine. But any guys that you kind of like in that spot, top of the draft, back of the draft, anywhere you like that you think a guy that you think maybe could perform really well and help themselves?
Well, to me, it's kind of like the running back position. There's astringenti, and then there's a lot of guys that are really good, but are definitely a step below. For me, that really good player is Jalen Walker from Georgia. I love the versatility he showed, playing off ball, playing as an edge rusher, just the explosiveness. I think he's gonna test well. I think that Jahad Campbell from Alabama is also going to test exceptionally well. I don't know that I personally don't believe that he is as good of a player, at least not right now, as he is an athlete. Carson Schlesinger from UCLA, to me, is one of those guys that is a better player than he is athlete. I'm curious to see what he runs, but he is one of those guys that he almost closes his eyes and can locate the football. You watch his UCLA tape, and before the ball is even snapped, he's already running towards where the running back or quarterback was going to go. And so to me, again, this is not a linebacker class I'm in love with. I think that there are some exceptional athletes. I think there's some pretty darn good football players as well. And so to me, those are the three guys that I am very much going to be keeping my eye on when we see the workouts for linebackers.
Now, do you think a team, when they draft Jalen Walker, because I think this is interesting, are going to see him as an edge and a pass rusher, or is it an early down off-ball guy and then a pass rusher on third down? I think his usage, because you're right, he's shown in college he can do it all, which is great, but where do you think he's going to get used in the NFL, and how is a team going to envision using him when they pick him likely in the top 10?
Yeah, that's the thing is I do think that when you select a player that high, then you want to just have the comfort of saying, well, this is our starting middle linebacker for the next 10 years, or this is our starting edge rush for the next 10 years. And
I
that
go
to me
back
is
to
the
Isaiah
beauty.
Simmons, right? Great athlete, top 10 pick, but what do you do with the guy?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and that's one that I think that sometimes that we need to be reminded of the Busts who are such spectacular athletes. I'll say this, and I was an Isaiah Simmons fan. I'll call
Oh, me
myself
too.
out because Simmons has not lived up to all the expectations. I see a different level of physicality with Jalen Walker than I saw with Isaiah Simmons. I saw more versatility, better in space, better catching the ball as an interceptor and things like that. With Isaiah Simmons, I'm still disappointed that Isaiah Simmons or Aaron Curry, if we go way back, guys that were such dynamic athletes that had a track record of just being spectacular, turnover magnets. Jalen Walker hasn't been that turnover magnet, but he just plays with a different level of physicality than some of the players that we just mentioned. So that's why I feel confident that he is going to wind up probably being a top 10 selection, or at least top of the first round kind of a guy. And I do think that ultimately he is going to play the majority of the snaps as the off-ball linebacker. But as we know, in today's NFL, that means you sometimes have to blitz. And I think that his ability, his burst, his bend off the edge just gives his defensive coordinator that much more flexibility.
Yeah, I'm with you. All right, let's go to the defensive backfield here, Rob. I don't think this is a strength of this year's draft class necessarily. We talked about, three of the top 4 or 5 corners in this draft are all dealing with injuries. Who are some of the guys that you think, and look, we know corners and everyone overrates the 40-yard dash. I don't think it's an overrated number for cornerbacks. You need these guys to be able to run. Who do you think could surprise people maybe with some of their running, and who are you kind of wondering how fast they might be when they finally line up and run that 40-yard dash?
Well, again, I think this is a fairly top-heavy group. I am a huge, huge fan of Travis Hunter, for example. I think that when you look at some of the other corners in this class that have been kind of bruised up a little bit because they've gone down through injuries, whether it be Siobhan Revell, whether it be a Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame. The people are starting to kind of slide off of them, and I don't think that they should. I think you go back to the tape, you definitely see some inconsistencies, but I think that some of that is coachable. And of course, those players are not likely to be able to run in 40-yard dash events, but I'm curious to kind of see if they are healthy enough for the pro days, what they might be able to do. A couple of guys that I think I'm higher on than most seem to be. I think are quality middle round prospects. Denzel Burke from Ohio State. Look, he's been beaten. But at the same time, when you start for 4 years against Ohio State, when every day in practice you're going up against the guys like Emeka Egbuka or a Jeremiah Smith, then I think that the practice is almost more challenging than the actual games themselves. So to me, he is one of the more battle tested and surefire NFL contributors. If not an upline starter, but a quality player. To me, Denzel Burke is one of those guys. Dorian Strong for Virginia Tech would be another one that kind of lives up to his name at times. I mean, just his physicality. I'm fascinated to see how each of those two guys wind up working out if they run in the low 4.4s, as their 4 or 5 star status indicated years ago that they would. But I do think you could see those guys both kind of start to make a significant ascent up draft boards as we get a little bit closer to April.
Do you think Will Johnson will run a 40-yard dash before the combine? I mean, before the draft, pardon me.
I certainly hope so. He was one of the players that I was going to mention a moment ago. Again, I saw Will Johnson 2 years ago as being one of the absolute elite players in the entire country. And then early this year, before the injuries, of course, he was beaten at times. And so to me, I still go back to the player I believe that he was on tape. And so I think that he is a top 10 selection all day long. And I hope that he winds up working out and just kind of proving that to be true. But if he does run and he runs even a little bit slower time than people are thinking, low 4.5s, I still would be happy about that just because I love the way that he comes up and runs support. I like his instincts. And I do think that he is a guy that I've had scouts tell me that he basically is the same thing as what they saw with Patrick Surtain, the second, in Alabama years ago. As a guy who came in as a freshman going against elite competition, was one of the best players on the field, and then just got bored at the college level as his college career went on. I think that Will Johnson's an absolute superstar.
Wow. All right. There we go. Strong words. I like it. Safety, another spot, Rob, where I don't take testing that seriously. We've seen a bunch of 4, 6 safeties end up being, really, really good players when they get to the National Football League. What do you keep an eye on when it comes to safeties, and what players are you watching as we hit Indy next week?
To me, safety is one of the most fascinating position groups of this year's class. I'm a big fan of Malachi Starks, but to your point before, when we're talking about, I think it was the Arizona wide receiver, Ted McMillan, it seemed like he got better as the year went on. Malachi Starks was kind of the exact opposite, that he played very well early and certainly the last couple of years. And then his play started to drop. I'm going to butcher his name, so I'm just going to say the South Carolina safety. But to me, he is, again, another guy who is such a dynamic athlete that you really got to be intrigued by him. Watson Notre Dame to me is a guy that gets an awful lot of buzz, and no question that his ball skills are a big part of that. Instincts, the just the playmaking ability. But there were an awful lot of plays that basically the ball almost like by divine intervention, and it's Notre Dame, that kind of just fell into his hands. And so he is a player that I really don't care how well he works out. I mean, it's definitely going to play some role in this, but I see a guy who's a better football player than he is an athlete. Maybe he's going to change my opinion of that, but I also see a guy that, again, was pretty fortunate in how the ball bounced for him. So to me, this is a safety class. I'm kind of curious to see how it all works out and then watch a lot more tape on these guys. Just because I see a lot of guys that are kind of living off of some of the production, either the defensive line ahead of him, or the cornerbacks, in the case of Notre Dame, maybe that help make things a little bit easier for them to create some big plays.
Now, I know you're big on the small school guys, Rob. Who are some of the guys you're excited to see, show what they can do? And that, look, I was productive in the FCS Division II, whatever, but I'm an athlete just like the rest of these Power Five guys are.
Yeah, there's a couple of guys. I mean, certainly when we go out west, I talked about before, with Howie Manor, the wide receiver from Stanford, and but let's go even smaller. I mean, Mountain West schools. So Jalen Royals from Utah State, I just think a dynamic athlete. Torrey Horton from Colorado State, similar kind of a thing. Dynamic athletes, the wide receiver position. We talked about before that this is a positional group that is pretty, very up and down, and I think you're going to see a lot of disparity between different NFL teams. So those are guys that jump out to me. I always kind of go back to the offensive lineman. To me, that's some of the guys that you can find a guy who played at the small school level. And then winds up going to the Senior Bowl or whatever. You can see that they can live up to all of this hype and really compete against the big boys. I think back a couple of years ago, Quinn Miners, at Wisconsin Whitewater, for example. To me, my small school guys, a couple of them, Jackson Slater, Sacramento State, the interior offensive lineman, and then Charles Grant, the offensive tackle from William and Mary. I had scouts that went through Arkansas Pine Bluff and saw Terry Armstead, that just be a terrific athlete, even before he was a terrific left tackle. And they think that Charles Grant is going to wind up posting numbers like that. And guys, that's crazy talk. I mean, I don't think he's going to run in the 4.7s the way that Armstead did all those years ago. But I do think that Charles Grant is an athlete that is going to be able to show in workouts that he is an NFL caliber guy.
All right, finally, give me some of your pet cats, maybe guys that you've kind of come across that fans maybe haven't heard of, that you think could be real sleepers in the draft.
Well, a couple of different guys. Again, Howie Manor, the wide receiver for Stanford, the guy I keep talking about because I do think that he is going to impress some people and wind up being not only drafted earlier, but a better NFL player than people are expecting. Savion Williams, I mentioned Jack Besh, the wide receiver from TCU. Savion Williams has some of the most dynamic plays on tape that you're going to see. For people who like to say a Laviska Shenault in the past, a guy who could play wide receiver, you could play tight end, you could play running back, you play kick returner. That to me, Savion Williams can do that kind of thing. He's just a unique athlete. And so again, a guy that I think that a very creative offensive mind, like a Brian Dable, for example, might be able to take full advantage of that. I think this is a running back class. You're going to see some big name players that they may fall down the board. They have to be from guys from D2, D3 schools. For me, Bayshell Tootin, for example, for Virginia Tech, I think is going to absolutely light up the track in Indianapolis. Devin Neal from Kansas, similarly. Woody Marks from USC, previously was in South Carolina. I don't know that he necessarily is going to be the most dynamic athlete, but my goodness, the guy catches the ball out of the backfield. He runs hard inside as well as has the speed to bounce outside. I think those are some guys that all of them are likely to be drafted on day 3 that I think are going to be future significant NFL contributors.
Rob, tell the folks where they can find all your great work.
Well, do a lot of work for Fox Sports, of course, just doing NFL draft analysis for them. And we'll be going down to the positional group every single week leading up to the draft, and then also do some work with Locked On Seahawks, actually a very Seahawk focused podcast, and so that's somewhere you can listen if you like the golden notes for myself.
What do you think the Seahawks are doing in the first round? Offensive line?
That's what I think that they want you to do. I mean, you consider the fact that they have made now 7 selections in the last 3 years along the offensive line. They
Has it
now
been
have
7? Wow.
seven, 3 tackles, 3 guards, and a center. And so the fact that they have brought in so many new offensive line coach, offensive coordinator, running game coordinator. They didn't have a running game coordinator a year ago, and the results speak for themselves. But I do think that they are, instead of zigging where everybody expects them to zig, they think they're going to zag. I think they're going to take advantage of the defensive line talent in this class. And I know that they took a defensive tackle a year ago. Of course, they got Leonard Williams. They took last year, took Byron Murphy II. I think that this is a team that is setting themselves up to try to have a dominant defensive line. And in their offensive line, they're basically going to try and coach them up rather than scout them up to try to give Geno Smith and that running game a little bit more protection.
Rob, always a pleasure, my friend. Enjoy the rest of the draft process. Have fun. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great, John. Thanks for having me as always.
Rob Ryan, go to foxsports.com, find his great draft coverage. I'm John Schmeelk. That's the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. We'll see you next time, everybody.